The captured Soviet T-34-85. What stunned American engineers? Hey there, folks. Buckle up for an epic dive into a story that'll blow your mind. A tale of Cold War intrigue, engineering brilliance, and a Soviet tank that left American experts scratching their heads in awe. It's the tail end of 1950. The Cold War is heating up, and the U.S. gets its hands on a prize straight out of the Korean War. A Soviet T-34-85 tank, built in 1945, complete with a spare engine. For the CIA, this was like striking gold. Why? Because this tank wasn't just any war machine. It was the backbone of the Soviet Union's armored forces and a symbol of their military might. The U.S. needed to know what made this beast tick. The government and the CIA tapped Chrysler, one of America's industrial giants, to tear this tank apart and figure out its secrets. By September 1951, they delivered a jaw-dropping report, 460 pages long, detailing every nut, bolt, and weld. This wasn't just a tech manual. It was a top-secret deep dive, locked away until the end of the 20th century. Now, we're cracking it open to see what shocked the American engineers and what it tells us about the Soviet Union's game in the Cold War. At first glance, you might wonder why the U.S. was so obsessed with a tank from 1945. The last T-34-85 rolled off Soviet assembly lines in places like Gorky and Omsk in the fourth quarter of 1946. The top producer, a factory in Nizhny Tagil, wrapped up even earlier in February of that year. But here's the kicker. In just 3 years, the Soviets churned out nearly 26,000 of these tanks, with about 12,000 built after World War II ended. These were fresh, battle-ready machines, not worn out from combat. The CIA wasn't blind to the fact that the T-34-85 was set to be the backbone of not just the Soviet Union's forces, but also those of its Eastern European allies, like Poland and Czechoslovakia, where production was gearing up. If a new war broke out in Europe, these tanks would be the tip of the spear for the communist bloc. So, yeah, the U.S. had every reason to dig into this machine. This wasn't your average teardown. Chrysler's engineers weren't just cataloging parts. They were sizing up the T-34-85 against America's gold standard. The U.S. was the king of manufacturing, and Chrysler was a heavyweight, cranking out everything from cars to tanks. They wanted to know, how does this Soviet tank stack up? They looked at everything, materials, tech, design tweaks, and how it compared to earlier models they'd already studied. This was about understanding the Soviet Union's industrial muscle and whether it could rival America's. Let's start with the gripes. The American engineers didn't hold back. The tank's transmission? Hopelessly outdated. The spring-based suspension was old school. They thought the Soviets should have switched to hydraulic shocks or torsion bars, like the ones in U.S. tanks. The turret's ventilation was weak, making it stuffy for the crew. Driving the tank was a workout, requiring serious muscle. And don't get them started on the lack of a preheater for the engine oil or the subpar air filters. But this wasn't just a roast. The Americans weren't tearing it down for kicks. They were looking for strengths to learn from. When Chrysler's team cracked open the T-34-85, they were in for a shock. The Soviet armor was a standout. Despite using fewer pricey, rare alloys than American tanks, it was tougher and more resilient. The Soviets swapped out costly materials for cheaper, more common ones, yet still managed to create armor that was both hard and flexible, perfect for shrugging off enemy fire. Then there were the materials. The Americans noticed the Soviets seemed short on synthetic rubber and neoprene, and their plastics were made with older tech. But here's the crazy part. Some of the materials in the T-34-85 were better than what the U.S. was using. This was a wake-up call. Maybe the Soviets weren't as far behind as everyone thought. The engineers spotted a few borrowed designs. For example, the high-pressure fuel pump in the tank's V2 diesel engine was a near-perfect copy of one made by the German company Bosch. But the Americans gave credit where it was due. The copy was top-notch, almost as good as the original. They only found about 5 such inspired parts, showing the Soviets knew how to take good ideas and make them their own. The Soviets' attention to detail floored the Americans. Take the tank's old four-speed transmission. It looked identical to earlier models, but Chrysler found tweaks. The gear ratios had been adjusted, and the gears themselves were smaller. The machining wasn't fancy. The Soviets were short on gear-cutting machines, but the steel quality had improved. This showed the Soviets were squeezing every ounce of performance out of their limited resources. In Soviet records, wartime upgrades were all about making production easier and cheaper. But Chrysler saw something else. These changes were about making the tank tougher and deadlier. This wasn't just a factory machine, it was a war machine built to win. Here's where it gets wild. The Americans expected to find a backward industry, but instead, they saw the Soviets were on par with US tech. Soviet engineers knew the latest tricks, and their production was as good as America's. Sure, they were stretched thin during the war, with shortages of machines and skilled workers, but that didn't stop them from building a tank that could hold its own. The automatic welding on the tank's hull was so good it left the Americans jealous. The castings were flawless, with no hidden defects. And while some parts looked rough, the engineers noticed something clever. The Soviets only skimped on precision where it didn't matter. For critical components, everything was machined to near perfection. The real genius of the T-34-85 was its design for mass production. The Americans were blown away by how the tank's parts were made to be churned out on basic, universal machines, not the fancy, specialized ones common in the US. This meant the Soviets could pump out thousands of tanks even when resources were tight, perfect for wartime. The Soviets didn't chase perfection for its own sake. They built a tank that was good enough to fight and easy enough to mass produce. It was like cooking a hearty meal for a crowd. You don't need a gourmet chef. You need something reliable that gets the job done. Let's zoom out. The T-34-85 wasn't just a tank. It was a pawn in the Cold War chess game. In the 1950s, the US and Soviet Union were locked in a high-stakes rivalry, racing to outdo each other in tech, weapons, and influence. For the Soviets, this tank was proof they could rebuild after World War II and challenge the West. For the US, it was a warning. The Soviets were a serious threat. Economically, the US had the upper hand. In 1951, America's economy was worth about $1 trillion, dwarfing the Soviet Union's. The US wasn't ravaged by war, and its factories were humming. The Soviets, meanwhile, were recovering from devastation, with about 40% of their budget going to defense, according to historians. Yet they still managed to produce tanks like the T-34-85 in massive numbers, thanks to their tightly controlled economy. Here's my 2 cents. The T-34-85 is a masterclass in doing more with less. The Soviets were up against insane odds, war-torn factories, limited resources, and constant pressure. Yet they built a tank that not only fought well, but also earned the respect of American engineers. It's like a scrappy underdog team beating the odds to win the championship. What gets me is the balance. The Soviets didn't waste time on flashy details. They focused on what mattered. A tank that could roll out in huge numbers and still pack a punch. It's a reminder that sometimes simple is better. This story isn't just about a tank. It's about innovation under pressure. The T-34-85 showed the world that the Soviets could compete with the best, even when the deck was stacked against them. It's a lesson for today's engineers, entrepreneurs, and dreamers. Constraints can spark creativity. This is just the start of the story. The T-34-85 is a window into the Cold War, a time when the world teetered on the edge. Want more tales of tech, history, or epic rivalries? Subscribe to the channel, and let's keep the conversation going. Drop a comment. Do you think the T-34-85 was a game changer or just a lucky break? Got any stories about Cold War tech? Share them, and let's geek out together.